Welcome to the Civil War Center podcast. Learn about the battles, events, and people that shaped a turning point in American history. I'm your host, Andy Lucian. Hello, everyone. Today we're sitting down with Richard Heisler to talk about Civil War Seattle. Civil War Seattle are tours that take you through Seattle and through the homes and historic locations of Civil War veterans who moved out there after the war. Richard also runs a blog, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and more. Today we sit down to talk about Civil War Seattle and the impact that the city had on veterans of the American Civil War. I hope you enjoy this discussion. Hello, everybody. Today we are sitting down with Richard Heisler of the Civil War Seattle. How are you today?
Oh, great, Andrew. Thanks for having me on tonight.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. We were just chatting a bit. You're the first guest I've had who is also into TikTok.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, so tell us a bit about yourself. You can even talk about the TikTok. How have you gotten into the Civil War and how have you studied it? And has this been a passion of yours forever?
Yeah, I mean, literally since birth, I think. Both my parents are pretty into history. My father especially, but I was born just outside of New York in central New Jersey, and so a lot of our vacations and things when I was really young, you know, from like I said, birth really was going to places like Gettysburg and Antietam and museums in New York and so on. So I was kind of steeped in it pretty early. My family also has a pretty long, I guess, tradition of military service. Not my father, but all his brothers, my grandfathers, great-grandfathers, everybody was participating in some conflict or another going back to the American Revolution. So I think that there was an awareness of that in our family that made it really easy as a kid to have military history books to read and play with my grandfather's, uniforms and medals and old, bayonets and stuff like that from World War I that from our family. So I just started that way, and trips to Gettysburg were probably the most formative. Going to see the cyclorama at Gettysburg and spending time on Little Round Top, that kind of stuff, at 3 or 4 years old. It just set the course.
You're similar to me. It was actually me. I begged my parents, I'm like, can we go to Gettysburg as a little kid? But I'm the same way. That's how it started for me, was going to Gettysburg. It was always the little dioramas for me, the little soldiers with the smoke and the muskets, and I loved it. And we would get bags of the soldiers, and I'd go home and set up my own dioramas and stuff. So it's an experience.
That's exactly what I did. My three favorites were the cyclorama at Gettysburg. That thing just rocked me to my core as a child to stand in front of that thing. The old Gettysburg Wax Museum.
Yeah.
I still I can almost smell that place from the remembering that it's like the experience there. And then some of the books that I would get from Gettysburg, one in particular was this Civil War coloring book that they still produce. You can still get it on Amazon, and it was Civil War uniforms and stuff. And it had this centerfold spread that was a Pickett's charge scene. So it was like you said, with the dioramas and all the little figures, I could go in and color every little figure on the Pickett's charge thing, and then take my toy soldiers and set that up on the ground. And so, yeah, that's. I'm sure there's a lot of people, if they've gotten to the point like you and I have, probably have similar origins.
Right.
But all of those little things, the figures and the toy soldiers, and just going to the battlefield, and yeah, it really gave me a pretty convicted interest in it from early on.
So is Gettysburg a particular interest to study for you in the war?
Yes and no. I think it is because I've probably spent more time there than any other place. It's easiest to get hooked on Gettysburg, I think, for anybody, because there's just so much about it. It's more accessible from distance than a lot of other places are. And at least with Civil War Seattle, recently I've put more specific focus on Gettysburg. I did a couple tours for my walking tour business this summer that were Seattle at Gettysburg, and it was historic cemetery tours telling the story of the Battle of Gettysburg through the individual stories of the Seattle veterans who were there,
Oh
because they
wow.
were pretty much involved in every aspect of the battle. And the reaction to that tour, and how many, it was sold out every time I offered it, and there was just this kind of magnetic quality to that subject that I didn't get with some of the other tour programs.
Mhm.
And now it's become a presentation that I'll be doing, a couple of them in January, actually. So it's not something I sought out to do, but I think just the appetite for it is there. So I've really circled back, I guess, to Gettysburg as an area of focus recently
I noticed
via Seattle.
I noticed quite a bit of Gettysburg books too. So that coupled with your story, I had to ask.
Yeah,
I was like, are you a big Gettysburg fan? I
yeah.
know
The
everyone's got their
Gettysburg, the
area.
campaign, as I say, the campaign histories are on the top shelf behind me, so the Gettysburg ones wind up there. We go further down, there's less Gettysburg, but just from my roots, like you, just going there, and going, some of my favorite memories, like going to reenactments there back in the 1990s with my dad, and going up to Little Round Top together, and just it's special for me that way. Even my third great grandfather was a New York veteran. He served as a nurse during the battle, and then was at Camp Letterman for 3 months afterwards. So it's my family history is even kind of tied particularly to that battle too. So it's
The
resonates.
movie Gettysburg helped quite a bit, and the book The Killer Angel too, really
Yeah,
helped
the
to shape
movie.
it in popular opinion.
Yeah, the movie, man. When I was just out of college, but kind of in college, and coming out of it, is really when reenacting hit a peak, as far as numbers and that kind of thing. And the Gettysburg movie fueled all of that. So like that late 90s, early 2000s was just, I mean, all it was like Jeff Daniels quotes of Chamberlain, and just, Buster Kilrain and all that. And
Yeah,
it was
right.
it was that movie was the Civil War for so many people in that period. It was
Mhm.
so inspiring and drove so much interest in it. So yeah, you had to love Gettysburg if you were in that era when
Right.
that movie was out.
Well, tell us a bit about Civil War Seattle. How did it get its start? What's kind of the aim of what you guys do out there? I say
Yeah,
out there
so
as in being in Ohio. So
yeah, of course. So what Civil War Seattle is my, I guess you would say, public history project, and in this year it became a walking tour business, and it happened pretty organically. I was, had this lifelong interest in the Civil War. I went to art school, and I had the intention of being a historical illustrator. Coming in the wake of the movie Gettysburg, and artists like Don Troiani and some of these guys were really hitting their peak with Civil War art. I thought that's what I was going to wind up doing. I was here in Seattle that's when I moved here in 1991 to go to art school. And I was interested in that history, of course, passionately, but I didn't draw any local connections to it at all. It's all Gettysburg is there, Chancellorsville is there, Nashville it's all there. It happened there. What doesn't have anything to do with me here.
Mhm.
And existed that way really until a couple of years ago, when I was visiting one of our local cemeteries that has hundreds, literally, of Union veterans buried in one particular cemetery. And as I was walking through, I noticed three men from the same New York regiment that my ancestor fought in, the 97th New York. And it somehow that clicked in my head. It's like, what the hell are these guys doing here?
Mm.
Like, these guys, this is like, did they come here together? Because there's three of them from the same regiment in this small cemetery that there's not a lot of men from the same regiment or from the same anything there. That's just a total, like, grab bag of different regiments and branches of service and so on. But it's like, wow, there's three of those guys here in the cemetery. What's the story there? And looked into one of them, and he was wounded at Fredericksburg, probably within 50 yards or so of my ancestor. And that's when it was like, wow, these guys were there at the same time. And like, this is when I go there to look at that place and where my ancestor fought there, or at Gettysburg, this guy was with him.
Mm.
They were side by side, and the fact that they were both wounded at the slaughter pen farm area of Fredericksburg. My ancestor wasn't wounded severely, and he became detailed as a nurse just after Fredericksburg, and then he stayed as a nurse, division hospital nurse, for the rest of his service. And at that point, I thought, wow, not only were they laying bleeding on the same spot of the battlefield at Fredericksburg, but they may have wound up next to each other in the hospital tent on the south side of the Rappahannock. When was my ancestor shifted to nursing duty? Was he potentially even caring for this other guy, the Seattle veteran, at some point? At that moment, it became very personal. Like, wow, this history is here. Like, I don't have to look far away. Like, this is so intimate and so personal that this guy was there. Maybe spoke to him. I don't know. Who knows? And so I started dabbling and learning more about who they were, and started a little Facebook page because I had a lot of friends that have wonderfully successful Facebook pages, and I was seeing what they're doing. I'm like, I'll throw my hat in the ring here, just for fun, just because I love it and I want to share it. It's a cool thing. I want to write
the best reason to start.
I want to write a 3-paragraph little description about what this guy did at this battle, because I found out about it and it's so cool. And I did more of that, and there was this incredibly positive, organic response to it, where people were going, holy crap, that is so cool. I had no idea. And I'd say, yeah, I didn't either. I've lived here for 30 years, up to my eyeballs in Civil War history, and I never looked. It was literally right under my feet in a lot of cases, and I never thought to pay attention to it. And when I went to look it up, there's no information about it easily publicly available. There's some organizations like the in genealogical circles, or descendant organizations that have some people that were pretty passionate about that. Again, in the wake of Gettysburg movie and the Ken Burns series, there was a surge in Civil War interest. And so here, a lot of people put a lot of work into cemetery restoration, getting replacement headstones for these veterans. So there was a group that were interested in it, but it's small, a couple dozen people, and there's nothing publicly. And I thought, man, if I'm into it and I'm looking for it and I can't find anything, somebody's got to do this job. So why not me? Why don't I start a Facebook page, throw some pictures, some little stories? And within a couple months, local radio stations were asking me for interviews about it, organizations. The Facebook page blew up pretty quick for Facebook. Anyway, it's slow going these days to grow on Facebook. Right. But it was like, wow, people care about this and they want to know. And what really changed the game is I decided to do a tour. Like, I love talking. I love to share this with people. Let me schedule a little thing and see if people will show up. And the first one I did, I just put it on Facebook, and 4 dozen people showed up the first night. And I was like, whoa, wait, I'm not even ready for this. I've never talked to 4 dozen people before. In the first few tours, I did more and more. They were kind of a little awkward as I kind of learned the craft of doing it, I guess. And I worked together with some local historical societies to say, hey, if you want to partner up with me, I've got all this information about these people in your kind of jurisdiction, so to speak, and started collaborating with all these people. And then before you know it, the demand was such that I made it a business and started, booking tours every weekend, all summer long, about the connections between the Civil War and Seattle. It's dovetails heavily with the local history and what these guys did here, which we can talk about more. So I wasn't expecting any of this. And now, so it went from a Facebook page of like, hey, this guy got shot next to my third great grandfather, to, wow, I've got a full-on tour bit, sold out summer weekends tour business, and civil roundtable presentations and podcasts and all this stuff in a TikTok that I love to do, all based on just hey, let me share a couple of photos. So the more I did it, the more response there was, and the more I enjoyed doing it and dedicating more time to it. And as it was able to actually bring in money through the tour business, I thought, I'm going to go with it and see what happens. And I think it's unique and it's fun, and I get to uncover stories that people don't get anywhere else because they're only published in Seattle newspapers. They're only in a letter collection at the University of Washington or my local historical society, which has massive, massive amounts of Civil War related objects in their collection. And without someone looking at it through those lenses, they've just been in a drawer for 120 years. So bringing the stuff out, I think there's just a lot of value for the history field in large to put this out there.
And I think it's surprising. I talked to Ted Savis of Savis Beatty. I talked to a lot of different people, yourself included, who turned the Civil War into a livelihood. And I think to an extent, we feel like it peaked all these years later, but there's still a huge demand out there for it.
Yeah, and what I've found the best is to not make it a battlefield tour with your like boomer uncle. That to shift away from that style, and I say that it sounds disparaging. In some ways, it is, because I think that detracts from a lot of people looking at it. Is they just think, oh, my dad or my granddad or my uncle's really into Civil War stuff. And I try to brand it and sell it and present it differently than that. And I always start off my tours with like, this is not going to be about tactical history of the Civil War. This is going to be some interesting stories, but this is going to be their lives personally. And it's going to be Seattle history, and it's going to be local history, and it's going to be this merging of all this stuff in history of Civil War veterans that were massive advocates for women's voting in Washington Territory in the 1870s. Like, that story sells the Civil War side of it, rather than just go, Joe Schmo was in the third Division Battalion, because people just go and they just power down and go to sleep. So being able to present it differently, I think, is what's allowed me to turn it into something that is becoming self-supporting. Anyway, tour business is tricky, regardless of what you're doing, whether it's whale watching or coffee shops or breweries or whatever, seasonal, and it's marketing a big challenge and everything. But when the public responds to it a certain way, you can go, oh, okay, there's interest here. And I prefer, and I don't know what other people would say. I know you've had, Pete Carmichael on, and I know he's engaged with a lot of public history and stuff. I prefer people who are not interested in the Civil War, who are historically literate to understand it, but to not have preconceived ideas and not come in with a bunch of, well, actually, and, so-and-so Armistead fell at nobody on this tour cares where exactly Armistead was. Yeah. How many paces from the stone wall and all that. It's bigger picture than that. And that's engaging it that way has broad appeal. I think when you get out of those Civil War specific trenches, it's history that people go, wow, I didn't know. And you go, well, okay, cool. Are you interested? Yeah, let me tell you more. And I think the history field in general could use a whole lot more of that.
Storytelling as opposed to just spitting facts at you, regurgitating. Yeah. I mean, that's like, think back to college or high school. I think everyone listening can relate. The teacher that you liked was not the one who said this happened on this day in 1861, and like you were saying, the 66th Ohio moved against the 17th Tennessee, and I mean, it's just it goes over your head. I mean, even if you're no matter how literate you are on the subject, I think it's still difficult to follow that.
Yeah,
but and there's into a narrative is much more. I mean, that's why the Killer Angels was so popular.
Oh yeah. I think that there's an absolute time and place to that. There's people that when I travel to Gettysburg and visit, I say, you take me on a tour and you show me, man, lay it on thick. I want to hear all about, let's talk about what, the different fields of fire for these artillery batteries and all this stuff. But you got to ask for that. And if you start with that as the base point, as the takeoff point, it's really hard to communicate with people. But then you weave in, like, who were these guys and what did they do? And Seattle just lays that out on a platter because none of that you can throw those things in. Oh, this guy was in Pickett's charge, this guy was wounded, or this guy was in this prison, and then tell that story. But it's not the focal point of the whole thing, and the individual stories are what captivate people.
And I would imagine you have a fine line to walk, similar to what I'm doing, which is you have newcomers and then you have people who know a lot, and you have to bridge the gap. Is that something? I know you said you prefer people who know history, but I'm sure do you get both crowds that come out?
Yeah. And I think that's when you're sort of knowing your audience in different platforms. And so on Facebook, for example, I haven't been posting a lot on Facebook, but all last year and all summer, I did a lot of live stream interviews. And in fact, with authors from Savaspeedy, we did every first Wednesday, we had a different author, a different book that would come on, and we would get deep in the weeds about stuff. And I'm like, this is great, because the people that want this will tune in tonight, and this is their time. Let's have Alex Rossino to come on and talk about his research into the lost orders of before Antietam and all that. I'm like, this is great. Let's geek out on this. I'll just turn it over to him and let him tell, and people can ask those questions. Those aren't the people on TikTok. Those aren't the people on a walking tour. The Civil War Roundtable presentation that I'll do next month is going to be different than the presentation I do for the local historical society, because it's just different stuff. So if you don't adapt to that, you can't have that. So it is a fine line, but having different outlets for those different things allows you to pick and choose. And if you just one package fits all, then you can't get any of them at that point.
How deep into the weeds do you like to get when you're studying the Civil War? Is that a personal interest of yours that you try to dilute for the public?
For sure. I've found I've evolved in it for sure. Like, so, these books behind me here, like David Martin's, or whatever's first name, Martin and Fan's Gettysburg books, where it's just, they're not the deepest of the deep, but they're so comprehensive as far as, movements of troops on an hourly or half hourly level, and exact position stuff. I really, really liked that. And the more that I've gotten into these personal histories, the more that I find that's what captivates me. So now my research will be going to the University of Washington special collections to look at some old ledger book between what this guy, who was, say, a 14th Connecticut infantryman who stood pretty much near the high water mark on the battlefield of Gettysburg, where the Vermont Brigade was, or the Connecticut Brigade was. And he was a leading railroad man here in Seattle afterwards, and a leading philanthropist, and had his hands in so many businesses and leading the city. Now I get to go into the city archives and untangle his whole life and all of these different things and activities with the Grand Army of the Republic, and what they did to commemorate certain battle anniversaries, or did they have a Christmas ball in 1897, and what building was it in? And I can go down to Seattle downtown and stand on that corner, and this is where such and such building was in 1897. And these guys walked up this staircase on this day 119 years ago, and I can figure out like who was there. And so I get heavily into the weeds with their veterans' lives more so than tactical battlefield stuff now.
Yeah, so
but I can still, you could go on and on about something happened at Shiloh or Chickamauga, and I'm all ears for sure.
So I want to get to Civil War Seattle. I know we're kind of getting a little lost, but it's fine because it's a podcast, right? It's a discussion. So when you study, this is a personal question of mine, and I'm sure there's listeners who have this question. So when you're studying these campaign histories, how do you remember all those troop movements? Because I know for me, it's like in one ear, and then I remember it temporarily, and then I learn a new battle and pushes it out the other. It's like
that's a good question. There's a lot of stuff that I don't remember, that I'll read that whole book, and by the time I get to the end of the book, I'm like, I don't have any idea where so and so's brigade was. Right. But when I was on that page, I could totally visualize it. And the stuff that sticks with me is the stuff that is reinforced through looking at it through 3 or 4 different sources, maybe. Hearing that story a couple different times, maybe hearing a lecture on it, and then reading 2 different books about it, and then needing to go back and answer a question for myself about it and go back into it the second time, and then I'll go, oh yeah, and then it'll sort of stick from that point forward. Second Manassas is a great one. Like, I couldn't tell you even the army structure of Pope's army and who was in charge of what division and that kind of, but I know the section of the battle that I've really gone back to 3, 4, 5, 6 times because the specific stories of my Seattle guys. Now I know a whole lot about Bronner's Farm or what happened there or different aspects of the battle, but a lot of it is it's gone. So I couldn't tell you about it, but the stuff that I want to know just enough to go back and look at it a second time is usually enough. The Gettysburg battlefield guides, like, I don't know how they do it.
Yeah, right.
but see, the thing is that's what they do. Whereas I could tell you where 200 veterans lived in Seattle, like where were their houses? We could drive around the city and I go, oh, this guy was here. This guy was here. This guy worked here. Oh, that building, that was that guy's company making creosote to put on pilings to build docks in Seattle. So that's my battlefield, I guess. So
yeah, you've looked at it from 2 different perspectives, like a zoomed out, eagle's eye, and then on a more micro level.
Yeah, but if I was in Gettysburg, that's how my brain would still function. I would know which rock so-and-so's right flank was on, and I'd have that intimate knowledge of it, but not being connected with it on the daily basis. I lose it too. It's hard. It's really hard. I've read so much about Chickamauga, and I couldn't tell you much about it, but I know where my Seattle guy's leg was removed. But as far as where somebody's division or battalion or brigade was, it's definitely muddy in my mind. So
I've talked to people and I'm like, how are you spouting all this off right now? But
yeah.
Well, but I want to know a bit. So tell us a bit about Seattle. You mentioned, as we're talking before,
sure,
we started recording, that it's just a little blip on the map of America. For the Civil War. So tell us a bit about it, kind of how it evolves, and what role it does play in the Civil War.
Yeah. So Seattle itself, the first white settlers come here in November of 1851. It's a party they call the Denny Party. It's a group of people from Illinois. There's others that are here from Maine and New York, and others that are in the vicinity. There's a group that sets out here with the mission to find a site to set the roots down to what would become a port city. So like a lot of cities elsewhere that maybe spring up because, Pittsburgh was a logical place for a city to be because of the 3 rivers coming together, and just naturally that was the spot. Seattle was kind of intentional in its early history. So even in 1851 is when they're first coming to even look at it as a place. Otherwise, there's some logging camps around here. There's, of course, Native Americans that have been here for thousands and thousands of years on this site. They're used this. It's a place that's existed, but it's not a town. It's not a village. It's nothing. They come here and say, this is where we want to build our city. This is the vision that we have for this place. By 1860 and the outbreak of the Civil War, Seattle itself numbers just over 200 permanent residents. So it's a village at best. It's a few houses that are clinging to very steep hillsides along the Puget Sound, so the main body of water that we're on here. By 1864, Seattle gets its first newspaper, so we can get quicker reactions, or not reactions, but news of the conflict. People here were very interested in it, but it's peripheral. We have 1 regiment of troops from Washington that are serving in Washington during the war. They're guarding frontier, basically what you would probably best know as frontier outposts, forts, and providing settler security from conflicts with Native Americans or that sort of thing. That's typical Western military service. Only 3 companies of the regiment that was here were actually raised in Washington. They were mostly from California. They filled the void when a lot of federal troops displaced and went back east to fight versus Confederates. So there's military action going here. It's very, very, very peripheral. There's some political conflict. Some people from the South, some people from the North, they're arguing more than anything.
Big surprise.
At that point. Yeah. But they're super, super interested in it. And at that point, until we get our newspaper in 1964, it takes weeks to find out about anything that happens. The Battle of Gettysburg, the earliest I can find any mention of it in the newspaper is July 21st of 1863. It's literally has to come down the Pacific coast, across to Panama, and up the Pacific coast to get old newspapers to Seattle to get the news.
Which is the route Grant took, right? I think to get out west.
Anybody that was here prior to the war, that's what they had to do, or it was months-long wagon trip across.
Yeah, right.
So there's not much happening here. 1870, the population is still only, I think, 1,400 people in the town. And at that point, you could count the number of men who had participated in the Civil War in Seattle itself on one hand. There's two that I know specifically were here and by the end of 1865, but they're very few. 1880, the Grand Army of the Republic, which is the Union Veterans Organization, it was established itself in 1866 in Illinois. We didn't have our own here in Washington Territory until 1878. So 13 years before the veterans get organized enough to participate in that national organization. And in 1880, in Seattle, there's only 75 veterans that live here. So they're starting to trickle out here. But by 1890, the population in Seattle between 1880 and 1890 increased by 1,100%.
Wow.
Because the Transcontinental Railroad arrived in this region in 1884 and 1886. Then there's a huge surge of immigration coming from basically the Midwest to here. The story of the immigration we could do for probably 2 hours. But safe to say that these men are moving westward after the war, but they just don't get here until the railroad does in general. 1890, there's probably about 1,500 that live in the greater Seattle area. These are Union veterans. But by 1905, it's up over 3,000. So they get here way, way, way after the war. But when they get here, they're a significant part of a leading generation, because the city's so young, right? Because it didn't even exist as a town, a village during the Civil War, and it doesn't come into its own until the late 1880s. So these guys come here, they're 40, 50, 60 years old with families. The population and the city itself are very young. The average person, if you look at the 1880 census or territorial censuses, heads of households are 35 and under here in large part. But then there's this whole group of men who had all fought in the Civil War, and they're all the guys that come out here with careers and leadership skills and training and education. So they come out here and become judges and lawyers and physicians and engineers and police chiefs and architects. They're also painting houses and working as farmers and stuff. But the way they insert themselves in here has a massive influence, and their identity as veterans really bonds them together. So it's a very, very, very unique situation. Because if they're Civil War veterans in Cleveland's been a city for a long time, and they're just part of the machine of running Cleveland. And of course, that generation takes leadership in Cleveland or Boston or whatever. But Seattle, they're all the first to do it. So they're chronologically very late for an influential generation of men who had been in the Civil War. So what happens here, and a lot of the storytelling that I do doesn't even get going until 1885, so 20 years after the war, and it doesn't even hit a peak until 1900, 1905. But these are the same guys. These are the same guys at Chickamauga and Gettysburg and all these places, but they live 30 years of adulthood before they even get here. So it's an interesting thing. It's hard I don't know that explains it very well. But the chronology of how it goes and why these guys show up and when they show up is tricky, and that's the crux challenge of what I do, is giving that context and importance in those stories.
And how do you set out to find these men who come out here? I mean, it's not probably as easy as picking up a regimental history because they're moving to Seattle years later. So how does that work?
Well, one thing I guess the entrance to this was for me, and probably for a lot of people, is visiting our historic cemeteries in the city. And you walk around the cemeteries and go, man, there's a lot of these old Civil War veterans headstones around the cemeteries. Mm-hmm. So that opens the ability to question their existence, right? And fortunately, there's been generations of Civil War enthusiasts and genealogists before me that went through these cemeteries and these records and made, they're hard to find, but made, collections of lists of Civil War veterans in such and such cemetery, or Civil War veterans in such and such town, or different historical societies. So you kind of know they're there. So the guide, there are markers along the trail that people have looked through and dug through the cemetery records and at least created that framework to consolidate some acknowledgement of their existence. They've really receded into the shadows historically in this city. And that's the challenge, and that's what makes my work difficult but also interesting, is going and finding who these guys were by just, okay, this guy's in the cemetery. Let me go back now and see, he was in the 14th Ohio. What did he do in the 14th Ohio? When was he enlisted? What was his war like? What was he a participant in? What did he do between then and when he got into Seattle? And then you wind up in census records. Historic newspapers are where I spend a lot of my time, and Grand Army goings on in different veterans organizations, all in the newspapers and the libraries. And so that's just it. And that's why I feel like I have a job with this thing, is because this information isn't out there. And that's where I feel my duty lies, is consolidating it and then using my ability to talk, which you're getting exposed to here, to lead tours, because that's what I love to do, is just be a storyteller. But then is to put this stuff into what will eventually hopefully become books, in other resources that then people can be curious about this and have somewhere to go. Because prior to this, there really isn't, unless you know a guy who knows a guy who's in a Civil War roundtable or something that maybe has looked into this. It's not publicly accessible. And so it's hard, but I'm trying to, hopefully my legacy will be from this, is like, oh, people can go to the work that I did, which will build upon the work of the cemetery research people. And then I can bring these guys to life and give them a context, and then, make it easier for people to find this part of our history.
Yeah, that's a great cause. And these tours that you give, so it sounds like you're going maybe the houses that they have, their burial sites. Kind of tell us a bit about how these tours work.
Yeah, the tours mainly this summer are through Seattle Historic Cemeteries, because they're kind of our outdoor museum. Seattle doesn't have a lot of historic architecture. It's a new city. We rebuild here very quickly. So it's hard to find physical remnants in a cohesive way to do tours from point to point around the city. But in the cemeteries, we have specific Civil War veterans, Grand Army of the Republic Cemetery with 500 veterans buried. So we can walk through that entire cemetery and say, let's pick out 16 guys today, and we'll tell the history of the cemetery, which will tell the history of the veterans a little bit, kind of like we're doing now, and then go through and do specific stories. And then I can build thematically on those. So I did a tour of just the story of the Battle of Gettysburg through the Seattle veterans that were there. So we'll walk 2 hours through 2 really, really large cemeteries, and go, this guy was on Culp's Hill. This guy was in Pickett's Church. This guy was across the fence from that guy at 3 p.m. on July 1st on Seminary Ridge. And so I can kind of weave it all through, like use the cemeteries as the context just to tell the stories. And then I did a tour of Confederate veterans in Seattle. Let's, because everybody asks, that's the first movie. There Confederates here? I'm like, yeah, there were a few. So let's do a tour about them. A tour that I did that was really fun was going through this one cemetery of the relationship between Union and Confederate veterans in Seattle. How did they get along together in a neutral place? Talk about the reunion events that they did, the ways that they did get along or didn't get along. Some of these guys had companies together. Their children married one another. So we can go through the cemetery and go all those stories. One guy's son murdered the son of another guy. One was a Confederate, one was a Union soldier. And then like that whole story is really dramatic. So the cemeteries really give the canvas to paint any picture on that way. And the most successful one that I did that was sold out every single time I did it this summer was murder and true crime among the Civil War veterans in Seattle. Multiple of them were murdered here.
Really?
Several of them were prosecuting attorneys or judges involving sensational murder cases. And two of them, over a span of 12 years, were the county coroner for King County in Seattle. So they had to investigate and make determinations on what happened to people. And their dying in Victorian Seattle was a horror show. So getting to tell the stories of people getting chopped into 17 pieces in the sawmill or run over by the train, or the crazy, crazy murder suicides and all this stuff that happened, but use the Civil War thing as just to connect the dots to footnote it in the background. So it branches out from the Civil War stuff, but the cemeteries allow me to go through and do this in any way that I want, any angle that I want to take on this. We can go through and stand over these individuals and say, this guy was involved in this, and then tell the story. So,
and are these veterans against veterans committing these crimes? Or are they committing crimes against others? Or
some. Let me see. I don't know of any specific veteran on veteran violence in Seattle. One Seattle Confederate veteran who moved to Virginia the final years of his life died because he got in a fight with another veteran at a Confederate soldier's home in Richmond. They fought over, they got in a fight over who was going to be the first to get their hair cut, and they got in a physical fight over the barber's chair, a tussle, and the guy fell down and he died like a week later. And he lived in Seattle for like 30 years. There was one who was convicted of manslaughter. He killed somebody. There's a number of suicides. The two that were murdered by people who were not veterans themselves, but had some kind of personal relationship with them, it seems. There's one Confederate veteran, his son killed a guy who was the son of a staff officer for General Meade. So that's the closest of like blue-gray violence here in Seattle. That's the closest I can get. There were some fights for sure. There were two guys that had both lost an arm that got in a fight. They're both Union veterans. They got in a fight. Neither one of them died, but one was injured pretty severely. I think that's we didn't have a Confederate kill a Union soldier or likewise.
So were these like soldiers who commit crimes then after the war?
Some of them
the
did.
Person who gets chopped up, what's that story?
Well, there was one guy, he was a Union veteran, and he didn't get chopped up. Well, there's a couple that had accidents in sawmills. One guy lost a foot in a sawmill, but there was one guy that was involved in a story because he was working in a sawmill here in Washington, and his part of the mill stopped, and he couldn't figure out what was going on. But in the adjacent room, a guy had gotten caught in the thing and was like stuck in the stuff in it. There was a Union veteran who got a job running an elevator in the 1890s, got the job because another Grand Army of the Republic man got him the job because he was 80 years old or 70 years old. He couldn't work outside anymore. Hey, I can hook you up. Yeah. This guy's going to quit. If you can come in and you can run the elevator. He got in a gruesome accident in the elevator where he got flipped out of the elevator and basically turned into cheeseburger between the elevator and the elevator shaft. So some of them find ways. They survived the entire Civil War.
I was going to say, yeah.
Homesteading in Kansas in the 1870s, all the stuff, and then wind up getting like run over by a wagon in Seattle when they're 80 years old. Our first automobile fatality in the city was a Civil War veteran that got run over by a car. He slipped off the curb and the car ran over him. So there's a lot of weird stuff like that that is just in keeping with Seattle. Victorian Seattle was just easy to find a way to get killed in a bad way.
You're cannon fodder for like 4 or 5 years, and then you get killed by a
There was a Confederate soldier. He was a Pickett's Charge survivor, actually, who got in 1914 or 15. He got hit with a baseball because some kids were playing baseball. I don't know, whatever. They hit the baseball, whatever. He was on his porch and it hit him, and he went over to their house and he pulled out a pistol and started shooting. And he missed the kid. He missed the kid by like 9 inches. The bullet went right into the chair or something right next to him. So he almost killed people because he went in with a pistol and just started blasting. Just knocked on the door. Don't you hit me with the baseball, and bah, 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 just started blasting away into their house. So that was a close call. We almost had a Pickett's Charge survivor kill a family.
That's unbelievable. I mean, yeah. I guess it makes sense. The horrors you would see. I mean,
yeah,
they didn't diagnose PTSD like back then, but I'm sure.
Yeah, there was a lot of tough suicides here, but less in a place like Ohio or New York or somewhere because. Or Kansas, a lot of them right after the war, they had a high rate of suicides in Kansas, say in the 1870s. By the time they get out here, they're pretty stable people to make that transition to be all the way out here. And they talk about that. There's one veteran who says the veterans out here are strong of body and mind, and they're younger than average. And so we had a lot of guys here very late as far as like Civil War veterans still being alive. So they kind of knew. One guy said, you rarely see crippled old veterans in Seattle. You won't see long, the one-armed guy with the tin can or a tin cup shaking it for begging, because they didn't have the strength to get through life to get them all the way across the country and that stuff on average. So they tend to be pretty well-adjusted guys.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Ironically, you wouldn't think, because man, suicide was an hourly thing in Seattle in those days. But our veterans tended to be operate on a pretty even keel, except a couple of them. They were more likely to get killed than to kill somebody else, for sure.
That's fascinating, though. I mean, look, we talked about bringing this full circle at the beginning.
Yeah.
When you pick up that Civil War book, it's typically, even if you pick up one that happens to look at individual men, it's following them through the battlefield. But to follow these guys through the culmination of their life is really interesting to see what they become, what becomes of them.
Sure.
Obviously, we know what happens to people like Grant and Lee. But the common soldier, I think that's a fascinating way to look at the war.
And that's there's very few general officers or leadership. There's some, but most everybody that's out here is just an average Joe soldier. And that's what's most interesting to me, is because even if there was a famous general or something here, everybody would know the story. Isaac Stevens was a pre-war governor, Washington Territory. He was killed at the Battle of Chantilly with clutching the flag in his hands. And people know about him. People know about Pickett or McClellan or Grant. But the dudes that came here afterwards they're just as average as you and I, walking through the city in their lifetime. But it can get really personal. Like where I live is a small suburb of Seattle called Bothell. And this town was seeded by a small group of Civil War veterans and their families that moved here together from the same county in the same community in Western Pennsylvania. And
Wow.
they literally platted the streets, built the first homes, were the first mayor, the first person on the school board. The town is named after one of the families, Bothell. An Andersonville survivor, George Bothell, is the namesake of this town. He was a state representative, a mayor. Like he is this town. It's literally named after him.
Mm-hmm.
The land that my house is on, that I live on here, was originally homesteaded by a man named William Johnson, 78th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. And so I am standing now on this land. I can't walk to my car without being connected to that history. If you don't know about it, you don't know about it. My neighbor doesn't give a shit about it. That's for sure. But I do. And so I go, man, this is William Johnson land. His homestead claim was offset by the years that he spent in the Civil War service. Like that literally enabled him to get title to this piece of land that I now own. And I can go all the way back to what the 78th Pennsylvania did at, Chickamauga. It's, it's just which lens are you looking at it through? So it's here. That history is all here, and it goes from today all the way back to wherever you want to stop in the Civil War.
Well, the thing I think I find most interesting is, in addition to you continuing their lives after the war, is that someone in a part of the country that they may feel like doesn't have much of a connection to the war may have much more than they realize. Absolutely.
And Seattle's kind of like the last on the list.
Yeah, right.
So if you go east or south from here, it's that history is even earlier than Seattle. In any town, any historic cemetery, anything between here and the Atlantic Ocean, there's going to be somebody that did something in the Civil War that's there. So it could be a small town in Idaho. It could be a city in California. South Dakota and Kansas and Montana and Idaho are filled with Civil War veterans. Maybe more so than here even, because that's where they were first, and then they came here after. Confederates, man, somebody studied, I haven't talked to him yet much, but so many Confederates flooded to the gold mines of southern Idaho right after the Civil War. In Nevada, there's towns that are named after Confederate generals in Idaho and Nevada, in Montana. Wow. And it's there. You just gotta look. And the public loves it when people that don't know about this find out. They're like, wow, I had no idea. That's the number one quote. I had no idea, or were there Confederates? Those are the two questions I get every single time, no matter what I do. And it's captivating to people. And that's what drives me to keep doing it, is because,
right,
you find out. And then my favorite thing is I've made connections with families, descendant families. And they have photos and muskets and letters and diaries and all this stuff that's just sitting in a box here in Seattle. And one person came into the museum one day with a pile of letters, tin types, multiple tin types during the Civil War, the guy's musket with his name carved into it. It's just here in a house. And he, his family brought it here. He had it here. A woman just last week that I'm friends with, their family gave me a whole bunch of stuff, photographs and all kinds of things that I'm like, I can't believe. They're like, our family doesn't care about it. See that something happens to this stuff. So that's, that I'm getting into that layer where we're starting to really, really see what's physically here as well in family collections and stuff.
That's amazing, because you're connecting history, you're bringing it back alive, and you are just telling stories that would otherwise be lost. You're really just telling a narrative and a story. But like we talked about, that's so much more important in a sense than the X's and O's of battle. Not that they're not important, but 160 years later, with the wealth of material in the Civil War, that's really where the material of undiscovered knowledge lies, is in those individual stories.
Yeah. And I think in addition to like the context and the importance of their post-war lives, and because that's the story of Western migration. It's the story of American exceptionalism and nationalism of the 1890s and becoming a global power. That's all related to these stories too. But what people, rather than the X's and O's of the battlefield, they want to know the X's and O's of why the war happened and what motivated these guys to go to war and how did they deal with these things after the war. Causality really is relevant now. And so that's when people come on tours and come to presentations, those are the questions they have. They never want to know, where States' Rights Gist Brigade was at Stones River. They don't care. But if they were they fighting for slavery? And then I'd say, well, let's talk about this in one individual and what we know about him. So yeah, there's just so much more around it that people want to know about. It's nice to offer that, I think.
And I think that's encouraging because that's really where the value in the study of history lies, is looking at the past to answer the questions we have today. And I think that's, we talked about TikTok and how both of us saw a great growth on there and we're kind of shocked by it. That thirst for it, I think, does come from the questions of, well, I kind of remember the Civil War from my history class in high school.
Yeah.
How does it affect what I'm seeing on the news today? How does it play into, or even, here in Ohio, right down the road, we have a Grant Street and a Sherman Street right next to each other. So grappling with the legacies of these men, Lincoln and the common soldier even. It's encouraging to see people looking to the past to answer today's questions.
Yeah, and they're remarkably curious about it. I think especially with Civil War history, you get in such a bubble about it, and again, the X's and O's of the battlefield, that you miss the opportunity to let people have that conversation otherwise, because you turn them away with that, and it doesn't even have to tie to some specific current events kind of thing, but it's just topical because it's sort of, like you said, grappling with we don't have to grapple just with slavery, but Grant and Sherman. I mean, I get more heat on TikTok. If I put a post about Robert E. Lee, I'll get traitor, slave, blah, 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 the usual kind of comments. But if I put a post about Sherman, it's insane the reaction I get from people about Sherman. He's a war criminal. He's this, he's that, he's this. And then you have to have the discussion of, well, they didn't have the Geneva Convention rules of warfare in 1865. Like, that's how they figured this stuff out.
And if you didn't want your farm burned, you probably shouldn't have shot a rifle at somebody else. Like,
well, yeah. And so all of a sudden you open up this huge can of stuff that you're not even talking about the Civil War much anymore, because you're talking about just general like rules of hostility and civilized warfare and whatever. And that's, people love that, and the relevance. If you can use the Civil War history as the way to let people have those discussions, it's fun and it's exciting for me. I mean, I don't know how your content is specifically on TikTok, but I'd much rather do stuff like that than a recap of the Battle of so and so, or this is the story of where they produced this certain 3-inch ordnance rifle, was this arsenal or whatever. That's kind of fun, but man, I'd rather throw a Sherman thing out there and just duke it out with some people over that kind of stuff. That excites me, and it challenges me, because then I'll go, I don't know the answer to that question.
Right.
Why? What the hell did Sherman do? I guess I better read about that now to know, because people have reactions that you have to counter react to. And as a public historian, that's thrilling.
And they'll fact check you to a T, to like the most minute. My fiance and I went to Ulysses S. Grant's 200th birthday celebration. And Dr. Kurt Fields was there, who's like the lead Grant living historian. Yeah. And this guy asked him a question about, down the road here in Georgetown, there's this lot, and Grant stepped foot there once. And it was like, you're just trying to stump him right now. But people they'll hold you to I mean, you better not make a mistake because they will call you on it.
Yeah. And I like that challenge.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people can get really defensive about it. And I think I did early on too. I think people would say, well, there's a difference between somebody challenge you and somebody throwing a stupid, well, actually, because I get a lot of that. I'd say, they'd go, well, actually, the Civil War veterans came out here to get free land after I'm like, no, they didn't. And you have to battle these misconceptions. But when someone's kind of like, well, I don't think so. I think so-and-so was there. And you have to go, well, wait a minute. Am I right about that? I don't know. Let me look it up. And that's rewarding because sometimes you can be wrong. And if you let down your defenses a little bit and go, well, this guy's thing sounds ridiculous and it sounds lost cause and whatever. And man, I don't want to give this the time of day, but let me look at what he's specifically saying. And a couple times they've been right. Like, oh yeah. Okay. You win. I learned.
They make interesting arguments, and you're right. Sometimes it's just nonsense. And sometimes there's not even an answer too. That's the thing. Sometimes someone will dispute a fact or that an event happened or something, and there might not be an actual answer because you might have multiple sources that are contradictory. And that's part of the fun of history is you're almost like a detective. Well, you literally are. You're going through and finding these people and their stories, and I think that's what makes it come alive. I mean, what keeps it alive.
It's awesome. And I think what I enjoy about it, kind of going back to the beginning, I guess, about the whole thing is since I'm not a battlefield guide and I don't work in a museum, and I don't work in a physical collection full of Civil War uniforms or something at an institution somewhere, I don't get to like walk the ground, so to speak, but I do get to walk this historical ground and connect those stories. And in that, doing that detective work is so rewarding. And if I did live in South Central Pennsylvania, I'd probably do what you were talking about with knowing every brigade and battalion at Gettysburg and have that kind of knowledge. But being removed from it, you just got to find your ground that you can walk and where that fresh detective work is, and do your best and roll with the punches, because you'll get some punches and some heat. That's for sure.
Definitely. You definitely will. Well, we've been at it for over an hour now. So do you want listeners a way that they can support you? I know there's TikTok, there's your website, it has a blog on there. There's walking tours, can they reach out to you anyway? Anything you want to plug?
Yeah. So you can just search Civil War Seattle on any platform. Some I'm not active on, but I have claimed my real estate across the internet and across the app store. But my website is civilwarseattle.com. That's kind of the hub. I do have a blog, but I've been not real active with it, but that's where the walking tour schedules, that kind of stuff. Facebook is probably my second best as far as in-depth stuff source, and a great way to communicate with me through Facebook Messenger, or to get my email or whatever is through either of those two sites. I do have a YouTube, but it's probably less active. And then TikTok, just Civil War Seattle on TikTok is going hard for sure. It's my favorite platform to work on at the moment. So I put the most as far as quantity on TikTok, but TikTok's it's pretty general. You're not going to get a lot of Seattle specific stuff. That's more general Civil War history for people all over. But yeah, Facebook and civilwarseattle.com are my hubs for what's going on, what's coming up, what's scheduled, that sort of thing. And if you disagree or agree or have information or whatever, everybody's got some family member that went out west or something. So I love to hear from people from all over. You don't have to be connected with Seattle. So.
Well, excellent. It's been a great discussion. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It was a blast.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Civil War Center podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe to help the podcast grow. I hope you'll join us next week, and as always, please head to thecivilwarcenter.com to learn more. And you can find us on Patreon in the link below. Please consider donating to help this podcast continue. Have a great week.